Let's move to the concept of appraisal now. Appraisal is something you really need to have a handle on. You need to know that all appraisers are licensed in the state of Utah. If you are not licensed as an appraiser, you cannot call what you do an appraisal. Appraisal licenses are given in two categories, certified residential or certified general. Certified residential appraisers can appraise up to 12 units, and certified general appraisers can appraise anything over that or under that. They can appraise anything, including warehouses and commercial-type properties. Real estate licensees are specifically exempted from the appraisal law. Because giving value opinions is so important to our industry, we can give value opinions without having an appraiser license. But you cannot call what you do an appraisal. It can be a broker's price opinion. It can be called anything you want it to, but it cannot be called an appraisal. Appraisals must have a date on them because they're only good for approximately 6 months. They have a limited lifespan. 3-year-old appraisals really don't tell you much because the market could go up or the market could go down. Lenders who are lending money on properties typically require appraisals that are no older than 6 months. Appraisals have to have the signature of the appraiser on it because his signature makes it a professional estimate of market value that can be relied upon for decision-making purposes. There's a 6-step process in appraisal, and the first one is to determine the problem. Determining the problem is the first step and something you need to know. Determining the problem or defining the problem might mean that you have to do an analysis of highest and best use, especially if it's raw ground. What use would give the owner the most amount of money today and in the future? But that's defining the problem. Then you conduct a survey, and you gather data, and then you classify the data. Every appraisal, you classify the data into 3 approaches to value. Every appraisal must have the 3 approaches to value. The 3 approaches to value are market data, cost, and income approach. The market data approach lends itself best to residential properties because there's so many comparables available. The cost approach lends itself best to service properties like churches and schools. Difficult to appraise because there's not a lot of comparable sales, so you lean on the cost approach to tell you how much it would cost to replace the utility of that building. And then the income approach lends itself best to income-producing properties, which are evaluated primarily on how much income do they produce. The more income they produce, the more valuable they are. Once this data is obtained and then classified in the 3 approaches to value, you could have 3 different estimations of value, one for each of the different approaches. An appraiser doesn't average at this point, they reconcile or they correlate. The term reconciliation or correlation is used at this phase because they don't average. They look at the property and determine which approach was the most valid and then come up with the figure based on their experience and the different evidence that they pulled together for their appraisal. And then they're going to issue a report. The report could be letter, short form, or narrative. Letters are very short, few paragraphs. A short form is primarily what they use. There are different forms for different types of properties, and a narrative is a big book written on this particular property. Not used that often in most of the appraisals you'll be working with, but it is used on large commercial developments or large commercial projects. When you're talking about value, you can use the term DUST, demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. These are the essential elements of value, and all 4 of them must be present in order for a property to have any value. Often, you might see the word situs substituted for the word scarcity because it still spells dust, but situs is not an essential element of value. Situs is merely a location preference and different from scarcity. Value in exchange is what somebody else might pay money-wise for that particular property. It tends to take the view of the purchaser who's looking at a number of different properties and using the principle of substitution, comparing the utility of one to another, and not paying more than what they have to get the property they need, the utility they need. It is closest to fair market value, and it is objective. Value in exchange is objective. Value in use, however, is subjective. It might be worth more to one person than it is to another. If you had contiguous property and wanted to extend the boundary lines of your residence or perhaps your business, then the property next door to you, you may pay a little bit more for than anybody else might pay for it because it's contiguous to you. That would be subjective in value in use. Fair market value is a knowledgeable, willing buyer and a knowledgeable, willing seller who get together without duress, with a reasonable marketing period of time, and come up with the value of a property. That's how fair market value is determined. Market price is what someone paid. Sometimes people get a good deal, so they pay less than fair market value, and sometimes they pay more than fair market value. Cost is what you paid for something in the past, and price is what you're looking for now. Under economic principles of value, there's one called conformity, which says that you have the best long-range situation going for a continued value and maintaining value and increasing value when there's a reasonable similarity in the properties in your area. If you put up a big mansion in an area of small homes, you're going to suffer from something called regression. But if you have a small home in an area of big mansions, you're going to profit from something called progression. Contribution, the principle of contribution, says that you should not make an improvement to your home that doesn't increase the overall value, at least the cost of the contribution. Now, we all do this. We all put things in our property because we like these things, which will not contribute their value back to the property. Best example in Utah would be a swimming pool. You put $28,000 in a swimming pool, you're not going to get another $28,000 in the sale of your property. Therefore, you violate the principle of contribution. Neighborhood cycle. Neighborhoods go through different cycles. There's an integration or growth stage, and then there is an equilibrium stage, and then there is a disintegration stage. Anticipation. Nothing's happened yet, but people anticipate something good or something bad happening. And if that happens, then of course, values could go up or down. Getting back to the three approaches to value, let's talk a little bit more in depth about the market data approach. The market data approach, or sometimes called the comparison approach, has a formula. The formula is comparables plus or minus adjustments equals the appraised value of the property. So, comparables plus or minus adjustments equals appraised value. A comparable is a property that is most near in all details the subject property you're trying to appraise, that has sold and you know what it's sold for. The idea behind the comparison or market data approach is comparison shopping. If you have a house that has 3 bedrooms, a 2-car carport, and it's a split entry, you can find other properties that are very near or similar to that, and those would be called comparables. We know what they sold for. Then we make adjustments plus or minus to make them more like the subject property. If a comparable is inferior to the subject, we add something to it. If it is superior to a subject, we take something away. These things we add to or take away are called adjustments. We do this with dollars. For example, a comparable sold for $59,000 and it had a fireplace, but the subject property does not. So the comparable is superior. So we take away $1,500 from what the comparable sold for in order to make a negative adjustment for the superior fireplace that the subject didn't have. It would work opposite if the comparable was inferior to the subject. So comparables plus or minus adjustments gives us the appraised value. We always adjust the comparables. We never adjust the subject. Foreclosure sales are not good comps because remember the definition of fair market value was no duress. So if you have a foreclosure sale in a neighborhood that's sold for a particularly low price, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to pull all the other properties down because it wasn't a sale that did not have duress in it. Sometimes properties it's difficult to find comparables for, and so we might rely more heavily on the cost approach. These are called service properties usually, like schools and churches. The formula for the cost approach is land plus the improvements minus depreciation equals value. So the difference between the cost of the improvements new and the value would be the depreciation. Now understand that we're using the word depreciation here in a different context than if we're talking about federal taxation. Appraisers, when they use the word depreciation, mean real-life things. They mean physical deterioration, they mean functional obsolescence, or they mean economic obsolescence. Now, physical deterioration is wear and tear. Old things that are worn out are not as good as new things. So we take the replacement cost new, and if the carpet's half worn off, we would depreciate it 50%. Functional obsolescence is poor floor plan, or perhaps inefficient wiring or insulation in a home. Functional obsolescence is something within the house itself that causes the value to be harmed or taken down a little bit. Might be a brand new home with a real stupid floor plan, like a master bedroom right off the kitchen. Economic obsolescence, also called locational or external obsolescence, it is outside of the control of the homeowner. For example, if you had a factory down the street that was always spewing out smoke and obnoxious smells, it would hurt the sale of your property, and that would be called economic or locational obsolescence. So we take the land value, we add on the improvements or the replacement cost new, and then we take away depreciation, and it gives us an indication of the value of that property. The income approach uses cap rate analysis. And on this one, we have to come up with net operating income. NOI is determined by taking the gross scheduled income and then deducting vacancy and credit loss to come up with gross operating income. The gross operating income, you take away from that the expenses of operating the property, and you come up with NOI. So, vacancy and credit loss are not an expense. They're taken off a property before the expenses are calculated in. Another thing you need to remember about NOI is that debt service, mortgage payments, are never a factor in determining the net operating income. The other trick that's often played is that net operating income is always annual, 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 annual. That's a hypnotic technique. Just snap your fingers and you'll remember annual. Properties have different ages. There's a physical life, there's an economic life, and there's an effective life. Physical life means it's still there, it's still standing. Economic life is, does it have usefulness either as a structure you can live in or producing money? An effective age has to do with the condition of the property. For example, if you've driven by a property that's boarded up and not used or cannot be used, it's still there, but its economic life has extinguished. Now, sometimes you can take those old properties and go in and rehab them and breathe new economic life back in them. Effective life or effective age of a property has to do, as I mentioned earlier, with the condition. If you looked at Brigham Young's former residence in downtown Salt Lake, the Beehive House, you might put an effective age on that of 2 to 3 years because it's in top shape. It's a historic property. Its physical age is over 100 years, but its effective age might be 2 or 3 years because it's kept in pristine shape because of its historic value. Appraisers have to go out and make a determination on how much remaining economic life a property might have in order to inform the bank that there's another 30 years of usefulness. Banks are real shy about making loans on properties for 30 years that only have a 20-year remaining economic life. And the last comment is gross rent multiplier. Gross rent multiplier, even though it sounds real fancy or cosmic, it's a multiplier, it's a factor, it's just a number. It's a number that you multiply times the gross rents in order to give you an indication of value. It's quick and dirty and not real accurate, but it does give you kind of a thumbnail sketch on the direction you might be heading in.